And we're recording.
Okay. Continue and continue. Okay.
Just a few more seconds and we can let everybody in.
Yeah.
Okay, here they come.
Hello, everybody. Let me introduce you to Krista. She will be our moderator. Krista, you there?
I'm here. Hi, everyone. Thanks
Excellent.
for joining us tonight. You can see that my name is Ask Me Questions for the chat. So if you have questions as Franz is instructing, feel free to post those in the chat. If I can't answer them myself, I will ask Franz to go ahead and field those questions for you. So welcome. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Okay, well, an apple a day, right? So today our object is to draw apples. And you can see behind me here, maybe I can make it look like I'm holding that gigantic apple. There we go. I'm holding an apple there. These are like, the one that's right behind me here is a classic example of the apple drawings they used to have. A lot of seed catalogs would have packets of seeds or, a catalog, and they would have these just magnificent renderings of apples, and they'd show a lot of times the leaf and what they look like. And they have up in this one right there, you can kind of see where there's a cutaway view of it. So then these apples over here, the ones that I've done, the one on the bottom is a pastel, and the other two up above that are ones that I did with colored pencils, which is the approach that we're going to take tonight. And so I started thinking about if you're a total expert, you can render things and figure out, but I kind of suppose that a lot of you may be kind of beginning. And so I was trying to think of some way that might make this type of thing a little bit easier. And when I looked at the cutaway section of the apple, it gave me some ideas. So if we could cut to the overhead camera, and we'll look at, here I have my apple, and I have my trusty kitchen knife, and I'm going to just slice that in half. Okay, so you might as well just get right into it. And I got the two halves, and so what I then did, get that seed out of there, I just put the apple down, and I traced it. And that's what I'll do on my drawing paper, but I just kind of wanted to show. And then I ended up, so that gives me the basic shape of the apple. Now, then I went ahead and cut a bunch of pieces out. I just traced it any number of times. All right. And this is something that you don't have to do, but unless you want to do it later. So then I cut them out. So I got my two apple shapes of the cross section. So this is what happens. Apples for the most part are symmetrical, and I cut it in half. And so I made a little slit halfway down on one and one on the other. And so that when I put them together, then this kind of represents my apple. And I can kind of look at the way that the cross sections look. Now, what I'm looking straight on at where I cut the apple at a 90-degree viewpoint, just, I see that. Okay. And if I am looking at it where I'm looking straight at this cross section, for the most part, I just see a line. Okay. Now, as I start turning the apple, then you can see how the profile of each of these sections changes, so that when I'm looking straight at it, it's the full profile of the cross section. And then as I start turning it, then the distance between the outside and the inside gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it just looks like a straight line. So then what I did was just to kind of give myself another idea of that type of thing, I took one piece and folded it at a 90-degree angle, and then you could staple it, you could use tape. I found just using paper clips kind of was very handy, because then I could disassemble it. Well, there we go. Okay, so now I've got kind of another section in there, okay, so that I'm looking at it and it's starting to form, kind of a sense of the shape of my particular apple. And that starts giving you an idea of that when I get into the detail and I start to kind of shade it and everything, I want to keep these structural sections in mind. So very quickly, let me just kind of finish assembling this. And again, it's just something that will help reinforce in your mind the shapes within the apple that will give you a clue on how to draw it. So from here, let's quickly put another one here. And obviously, if you go ahead and you do thousands of these things, then you'd get a solid apple, and that would be kind of a reproduction of what your apple looks like. I'm not going to bother with that other one. This one here. And if I put a toothpick kind of in the center here, that can be kind of my stem. And so I've kind of created this little visual guide to give me an idea of how this thing is put together in terms of what does the individual shape look like if I look at it straight on, or if I'm looking at it at an angle and as it goes around. Okay, so we'll take it from that. And then since I cut my apple in half, I want to kind of reassemble it. So I just take some toothpicks here, and I'll just kind of put some pins in there. Well, I really got it right in half. I got even the stem. Okay, so then I will get it approximately so it's back together. So now I can stand it up and use it as my my visual aid. This is what I'm going to be drawing. And I'll look around and kind of decide that this view where it's just pretty much just red isn't nearly as interesting as kind of getting something that is a little bit more modeled and has a few more things to it. And then I'm also going to take my trusty kneaded eraser, and I'm going to kind of build it up a little bit. So instead of just, I can see kind of down on top, and I can also see the sides. And to me, that's a little bit more interesting. You're seeing it from up above. So, okay. All right. Now, actually, I totally forgot about, let me take this apart for a minute. Forgot about, okay. So this is my suggestion. Is go ahead, if you have a knife handy. If you don't, then, it's not to worry. This is something that occurred to me after I wrote the materials list, but I'm going to just kind of take advantage of this being like that. I'll put the apple back together. Okay, so now I've got my apple back. Put it so I can see it. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so now I'm kind of ready to go. Now, in thinking about that, okay, so this is the entire shape of looking at that apple straight on. And if you want to, I mean, I could sketch it and get some kind of a sense of, what it's supposed to be. But now I'm going to kind of put my line about where the center is. If you think about on the inside, it would be, the seeds and stuff run through there. But now I'm going to reference this idea where I've kind of cut out these shapes, and I can kind of see the cross sections at different angles. And so I can kind of come around here. And I'm just doing light pencil work. So from the center, I can start imagining where those other sections are going to be. And they're all going to kind of start at the top here, and then it would go to the back. And then I'll have this other one that's kind of in the front. And then I'll have another one that is kind of coming in through here. So I'm kind of, and then I can imagine where the back ones are. It can be kind of coming like that, straight on like that. And then the same thing here where I'm thinking, all right, that's going to be like that. And you can kind of see that I'm starting to flesh out where the apple is. So it's helped me kind of create the structure for it. So then if I very lightly start working across this way, and then I'm also referencing my apple so that I can get a close proximity of what the actual shape is. Because I've noticed that now this, I don't see quite that. Okay, so already I think it's starting to look volumetric. And part of what you needed to decide is, you know, if you're drawing an apple, and let's say you have like the Albrecht, there's a really famous Albrecht Dürer picture of Adam and Eve, and they're holding an apple. And this could be a horrible pun, but if, you know, the apple becomes a bit part, you know, then you're not as concerned about trying to, you know, get a lot of detail. But if you're focusing on like the apple to be your main interest, and that's really what you're trying to do, then this type of thing is well worth, you know, trying to work out, I think. Now, I'm going to render it so that it looks more like kind of a recognizable apple, very similar to, you know, what was up above from the seed catalog. But, you know, if you want to, you could be very abstract with it and kind of use this as a guide and then just kind of take it beyond that. It's just, it depends on what it is that you want to do with it. But I thought for tonight, we will kind of practice drawing an apple so that it is a little bit more kind of like that seed catalog. Okay, so I've got, you know, the basic structure, and I've got these lines in here kind of light. And again, you can kind of see how already it's starting to look substantial. All right. Now, when I go over that with the pencils, though, I don't want the line to be so obvious that, you know, it's going to interfere with the color pencil on top of it. So what I do is take a kneaded eraser. These actually, a red and a blue one together, you might be thinking, Faber-Castell makes a red and gray and blue and yellow kneaded erasers, and I like the ones that are a little more colorful. And I'm going to get rid of the little box that I put around there. And move it across there. And then the eraser is a little bit sticky. And so that enables you to be able to pick up a lot of the graphite in order to, I just want enough of those lines in there to kind of help remind me that these are the shapes. Okay. Now I'm using, real quick, let me get a little glance at the paper that I'm using. With the color pencils, I like using, this is like a Legion paper Stonehenge. It is 250 grams per square meter. But you could use other papers, you know, it's kind of whatever you have handy, as long as it's a nice drawing paper. This has a slight tooth to it, and it's a heavier paper. It's 100% cotton fiber. So it's a very archival, strong paper, and it has sizing. So the sizing of a paper is put in there so that it protects the fibers of the paper And so if you have some sizing on the surface of the paper and you make some light marks and you want to erase it, it's going to pop right off because it hasn't been beaten or absorbed by the fibers of the paper yet. Okay, so I'm going to be using Faber-Castell's Polychromos. You could also use, they have a really nice a line of Goldfaber pencils. All their pencils are highly pigmented, but they're oil-based. And so just a real fast little departure here. What that means is that also when you draw, okay, I like drawing with a nice sharp point. Okay, and once I sharpen the point, then when I draw, it's not like you're writing somebody a letter, all right? What I do is hold it near the end. Let's see if I can get my hand in here enough that, okay. And so that way I just can use just a little bit of, not just the weight of the pencil, and I can get a nice light layering on the paper. And if I go over it and go over it and go over it, you can start seeing the grain of the paper come through, and you can use that to your advantage. Now, with an oil-based pencil, once we start getting to the point where we want really intense color, then if I use a little bit more pressure, then that starts layering more down on top of it. And I can finally get to a point where I get it where the paper is totally saturated. Now, the advantage of the oil-based color pencils is that you can build it up and build it up and build it up. With the wax-based pencils, there's a tendency for, you can only put so much wax down and then it starts actually chipping off. So once I have that totally saturated with my oil-based pencil, then I can go back on top of it with another color and it's still going to stick. So you could develop all sorts of very interesting nuances of color by layering and layering and layering. And you can put that on so that it's really heavy and you get very interesting tones, which is going to be very helpful when we get to the apple. Okay, I think I want to just very lightly use a little more pressure to get a little bit more of that off, because I want to make sure that, you get the, okay. So this is going to be the fun part where it's just like kind of coloring it in. And I'm also going to notate the shadows. On my apple, I have, since I have lights for tonight, I've got like kind of one shadow that kind of comes around this way from one set of lights. And then I've got another goes up. And what I'm doing is kind of see where the shadow hits this side of the apple. And so as I look at it, it's a little bit above, halfway between where the stem is, which is going to be about here, and the top of the apple. So then that kind of helps me get the shape of the shadow as it comes across here. And then I have another shape that comes across here and then is a little bit odder off to this side. And then I can use that to help develop the feeling for the apple. Okay, so I'm looking at the stem, and the stem is, pretty much right in the center. So if I'm kind of thinking about, showing, all right, where is that, that kind of depression in the apple, it is pretty much like in through here. And if I look at the center of it, it's about here. So I'm going to just draw that stem in there. Okay, and then it's kind of cut off by show. All right, now I'm going to look to see, all right, where shall I start? I'm going to start with the light colors. And so with my apple, I'll kind of flip it over. You can see where I've got all this kind of yellow that I can see that you can't, because I'm looking at it from the sideways. You're seeing it from up above, but you can see better what I'm doing here. So I've got this little bit of this yellow that's coming in through here. So I'm going to draw it, but instead of just drawing a straight flat patch, I'm going to try to follow the surface. I'm going to try to follow that curve. So it starts here, and then it kind of comes in through here. And you can see that the motion of my drawing here is to indicate that shoulder as it comes around. And then it comes here and spreads out a little bit. And I'm just putting a very, very light layer of color down in it. Okay, over here, and I've got some that comes around this way and then comes down, follows the curve, and then kind of spreads out across this way and to the edge of the apple, and then it disappears. So there's an implication that goes around there. Okay, so it comes across here, comes down here. All right, so there's that pat in there. Just a little hint here. Again, you can see I'm making curves. Okay, now up here, kind of here's the stem, and then there's a shape that comes across here. The color of the whole inside here is lighter. And it comes up. And again, I've got these kind of preliminary little, kind of cross-section slices as they go around there. So I'm using that as a guide of the kind of strokes that I want to make here. So I'm going to surround that whole stem. And then right in through here, it's almost like here it flattens out a little bit, but here it's much more compressed because it's kind of in the front, and it kind of prevents me from seeing down into the hole. So again, I'm kind of making these bits that are kind of playing with that curve. So essentially, the apple is coming up, and it gets a little bit bigger, and then it slopes down. Coming up, gets bigger, slopes down. And so that's what kind of creates that feeling for the center. Okay, so that is pretty good for putting in. There's a little bit over here yet. A little bit of, it's not only kind of lighter, but it looks like it is bruised a bit. And then same thing here, there's a little bit that's on this side. Okay, so I'm just trying to get a little bit of basic color down. All right, now the apple that I have, instead of it being like, this really vivid bright red, is actually kind of an orangish color. And I am based presently in Michigan, and they have an apple called a Honeycrisp. And that's what this particular apple is. So instead of it being like a real deep apple red, like a Red Delicious or something, this is more kind of like a pinkish color. So I'm going to start putting in a real light red. And you can see, again, I'm kind of following the shape of the apple surface. So I'm curving it from up here and then coming down, curving it. That's kind of flat, and then it starts curving in the opposite direction. It just gives me a feel for the apple. This isn't like a flat apple shape that I'm doing, that you might have in kind of a cutout if you wanted to do something for a scrapbook or for. And then I'm also thinking about it curving around this way. So not only does it curve this way, but it curves that way. And even though, it doesn't necessarily look rendered and all volumetric at this point, by applying the color in this, it gives me like a sense of the form of the apple. Because eventually, when I start putting in some detail and some heavier layers and highlights and whatnot, that's when, you know, this kind of thing is going to show up even more so. All right. So same thing at the bottom of the apple. You know, this is more of kind of straight on this way. And then as you come around this way, then I want to kind of curve it. All right, so.
Franz, could you tell our audience what color, numbers, and names you're using?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, this one, what's really nice about the Faber-Castell line, whether you're using a watercolor pencil, a soft pastel, no matter what material you use, you're using the same pigment. They use the same pigment for the pencils, for the pastels, and for everything else they make, the watercolor pencils. So right now, what I'm using is deep scarlet red, and it's a 219. And the yellow, this actually is kind of like a yellow green, and it's cadmium yellow lemon number 205. And so if I wanted to use, at some point, I'm going to use a Pitt pen perhaps for a little extra detail, a little extra saturation. So if I wanted to match the pencil color with a Pitt pen, which is an artist brush point pen, you know, I could choose the same number of color for the Pitt pen. A lot of times, though, what I do is just kind of approach it more from kind of an intuitive sense. And, you know, I'm looking at the color rather than the number. Okay. All right. So we have it kind of blocked in there. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start working from the center out. And when I look at my apple, the entire inside is basically green. But I wanted to put that layer of yellow down first because it's variations of green. And if I start with a lighter color, then that's my underbase there. All right, so. And then this green kind of comes out just a little bit in through here. Okay, so now this is where I'm starting to kind of think about making marks and strokes that are consistent with the shape of the apple. All right, so some of that in there. Okay, and I'm putting a little more pressure to get a little darker. All right, so, and this one is the number 168, earth green yellowish. This name. Okay, so now I'm going to go to slightly darker one, and one that's a little less yellowish. And sometimes these are a little hard to read. And this is, well, under these lights, I always, it's, I don't know what that one is. I will do, I'll check it later. Okay, so right in through here, I can see down in there that I've got these little kind of vein things that are coming. And this is really great way to start kind of working with that notion that, you know, this is coming down. So I'm going to follow the contour, and then as it comes around in through here, it gets a little bit darker. And then especially on the sides now, like right in here, gets a little bit darker. And kind of goes back up and through here. So I'm going to take this color, go back over here a little bit more to kind of get a sense for that depression in the apple. And then very light touch with getting that to blend in there like that. Okay, so then when I look at the top, it's almost like a bright orange. simulate that. I can use my, and so it's really kind of nice, bright orange. Really pops out. And then it's a little bit darker as it comes down the stem. So I'm going to kind of put just a little bit in there, and it gets a little bit, it's the darkest kind of right in through there. And then it is a green stem. So I'm going to put that in very lightly. Just a tad of this to brighten one side up, this one left side of it. And then there's a shadow that I'm going to use the browner part with. And it's right down in through here. And then it kind of follows up the side and through here. And then kind of spreads over here a little bit into the darkness. And then actually falls on top of the stem a little bit. Okay, I want to slightly brighter green so it doesn't get mixed up with the background, but I want to bring that a little bit more. This a little bit darker. Because I kind of figure that if I get that center pretty well established, then you can start feeling that, all right, now it's really starting to look like it's going into the hole, and I can start working out. All right, so I've got, kind of a good start with the red, and I've noticed that kind of in the back of my apple, it's a lot darker. So I'm going to start building that up a little bit more. But the thing that's really interesting is that on the apples, what really I think makes the apple look really nice are the highlights. And so if you look really carefully in through here, this is really kind of dark. But then on this one surface that starts flowing down, it's lighter. It looks almost like there's been kind of a transparent white put on part of that. So as I build across here around the kind of the top part of the apple, I'm going to keep that a little bit light. And then I'll note where that highlight stops. So I'm kind of coming around here. I'm thinking about, right, this is the top of the apple, and then it starts going down into that hole, into the core. So again, I'll start kind of drawing it with the notion of using the strokes that would be consistent with it going from the top. And I've noticed that it looks like it's a little bit darker right at the shoulder, and then lightens up a little bit as it goes down. And then over and through here, I've got this kind of shape that is almost like, looks almost flat. And now what I'm going to use is a number 127 pink carmine. It's a little bit darker. So now I want to just come right to the outside of the edge there, and then kind of make it a little darker. I come around here, and then in this way, and then down here.
Franz, could you the color numbers for the orange, the dark brown, and then the darker green color, please?
Okay, all right. The orangish color is a number 109 dark chrome yellow. The dark brown is a it's hard for me to read these in this light because I get a lot of reflections and the gold is there. So it's kind of it's kind of like a walnut brown. That's the best I can do unless I stop, get my other glasses on and stuff. So, and the other color that you were asking for, like
it would be the darker green color.
Oh, the darker green color. Oh, okay. This one. Yeah, this is another one that I in this light, I just can't read it. It's, oh, okay. Here we go. It's a Turner Green, and it's 165. Okay. All right. So now as I start developing that, then I'm going to go to almost like this maroon color, and it is a 194 red violet. And I want to, keep this nice and sharp. So right here, kind of on the shoulder again, it's a little darker. And especially in through here, I'm going to use a lot of pressure because I want it to be kind of a lot darker. And then I'll lighten up a little bit as I come around with it. But you can see the way I'm starting to kind of develop that sense of the highlight. And then I can actually take a white, which is easy to read. It's 101. And then I can kind of play with that a little bit. I can kind of add, so it looks a little bit more glazed over even on top of the dark, and then come back and then go on top. But well, I don't want to develop one area too fast before I get the rest of it kind of working. But you can see the way that it's starting to kind of look more apple-y. All right, so here at the top, let's start working with this part. I want to think about it rolling over in that direction. I'm going to let it kind of start overlapping on the yellow. I'm going to use a little more pressure and then lighten up on it a little bit and then start getting these to kind of come out. I can go over that yellow just a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to start to build up the red. And I've noticed, like, kind of right around here, it stays more of that kind of pinky color, and then it gets to be a richer red as it comes down about there and farther down. And then, yeah.
To build up the color with the red, are you using a lighter pressure? Are you more heavy-handed with that?
Well, I start off with the light pressure, and then as I'm looking at it and I see where I have the darker areas, then I can go over it again with a heavier pressure. So I want to kind of keep a light touch, and then as I come into these darker areas, then I will use a little more pressure. Okay. Okay. And so if you all have your own apples, then, this is kind of what I would recommend that you do. All right, so I'm going to take this, forget what this was called again. This is the something red, the red violet. Huh. Okay, so I'm again kind of looking at the outside is a little bit darker. So I'm going to start off lightly. I've already kind of put a nice saturation of red down with, and now I'm going to start building that up because it's like it comes across. It's darker down below. Okay, I'll look up here, see what I need. It's also a little bit darker up here, but it's more kind of like a greenish color. So I'm just looking around. This is a green olive. And I'm going to put just a little bit of that, like kind of in through here. Just, kind of a little light touch to add just a kind of a green. And on top of that red and that kind of maroonish color, it's going to turn it into kind of a purplish. There you go. That's looking right. A little bit of red on this way. So just a matter of kind of like layering. You kind of experiment to see what you think is going to work. And since you get to eat the apple after you have finished drawing it, then nobody's going to be able to say, "Yeah, that doesn't look exactly like that apple," because you've consumed the evidence. It will look like an apple, but perhaps not quite exactly like the apple you were working on. Okay, so I still want to kind of darken that a little bit. And so I'm using a lot of pressure now because I want that to be really solid. Because it's where the light is not reaching it, because it's kind of, when you think about it, this outside part here is as wide as it gets. I mean, if I kind of flip it over, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. That this is the farthest the apple sticks out. So then this part is going to be more in shadow because the light's coming from up above it. And again, since you have the on top view of it, you can't quite see the same thing that I am. Now, as I start getting this darker color, I want it to kind of creep into that a little bit, but I want it to be more solid as it comes down here. Now, as often happens with rounded objects like, balls and stuff, especially if they're shiny, they pick up a little bounced reflective light off of the background. And in this case, it's like kind of a blue felt. So there's just a slight light blue highlight that is down here. So this is Cobalt Green, number 156, I believe. Or it's either 156 or 136. So as I put that on top of the red, it's going to kind of turn it into like that nice brownish color. But then as it goes on to kind of the lighter colored paper, when it's more of a blue, and then I will, again, keep your pencils sharp. And I could go over on top of that a little bit and kind of get to blend. I'll come back with this one. start building it up a little bit into here. Okay, so this little bit of white, as it kind of creeps down to the bottom of it, is going to imply that there's some reflected light that is coming off of the thing. Okay, so just so that we can kind of get some other parts done before we totally run out of time. What I want to do now is maybe kind of block in this background a little bit. And I'm using a very light touch here because I just kind of want to deposit a bit of pigment. And if I use a light touch, then I am keeping a similar texture to the felt that this apple is on top of. And if I want to make it darker, then I can kind of go back where I've been. But this enables you to have, kind of build it up to however vibrant and dark you want it. Okay, so I had my shadow line kind of in through here. So now I'm going to come back and I'm going to start making that part darker. Because if you can kind of establish the ground plane, and shadows are really good for this, gives you an opportunity to kind of make that, as you're working on your object, it'll stand out a little bit more. Okay, so this is coming across from here. Kind of lost sight of where my original. And I want to avoid something like drawing a heavy line and then go to that, because when you look at a shadow there, you can see an edge. You can see the difference between light and dark, but there isn't a line drawn there. So I want to be careful that I can build up the difference by coloring the whole surface area. And I want to avoid a line. I don't want to outline the shadow. I want to build it up as a contrast between a light blue and a dark blue. So then that'll also give me an opportunity then to start kind of playing off the edge of the apple up against the shadow. And that'll help kind of get the apple to stand out as well. Okay, so then I have another shadow then that kind of starts about here. And this one kind of comes at a little different angle. And then I will start to put that in too. So, essentially both of these shadows are about the same value. Okay. Then I can kind of think about this shadow comes here, this shadow comes across here. And so now what I'm going to do is go with a slightly darker blue, and where you have the overlapping the shadows, then you get this little kind of, it's almost like a kind of a gothic arch here. It comes to the point and it comes across like that. Okay. So if that's too light, then, I can use a slightly darker color, as I kind of had mentioned, that with the advantage of working with the oil-based pencils is that you can keep on layering and layering. So maybe we actually need to make that just a little bit darker, because then that'll start getting that apple edge to pop a little bit more. A lot of this is just kind of, just experiment. I'll have to go back with a slightly darker. But, if that shadow is too weak, if it isn't dark enough to make the apple pop, and, just, okay. Maybe come back with an even darker blue for this little bit in through here. Okay, so I could get the idea. Like I said, we're running out of time here. I want to get a few more things done before, but yeah, you can start to see the way that this apple is developing. Okay, at this point, I might want to take another bit of orange in through here on top of the red. Very lightly go on top of the yellow. They keep on developing. Okay, so now it's around here, it looks like it's getting dark again. So what I'm seeing is that this curves like this, right into there. But I still have this highlight down here. Okay, up here at the top, get some more of this in.
Franz, can you tell us the colors, the blues that you use for the shadow, please?
Yeah, the blue. The problem I have with reading these sometimes is that, okay, this is a Prussian blue number 246, and that was kind of for that one. And then to make a slightly darker shadow, this one should be a little bit easier to read. This is a 153 Cobalt turquoise. Okay. Okay, so now what I'm seeing here is this also has a slight highlight to it, and it manifests itself as being kind of like this orange color that swoops down like that. And then I'm going to come back with some of my yellow because it's a little more intense in through here. And this whole area in through here it's kind of interesting. It's like it picks up the yellow, kind of wraps around from the side and then goes into Trying to get this. Helped a little bit more before we run out of time. But I think that you can kind of see, what the general working procedure is. I want to get a little more of this, this green to kind of come up in through here. And it kind of comes up in these little kind of pointy ways. It's almost like you get these little kind of little mini spears that come to a point. It's just a little bit of one there. Okay, make that a little bit redder. Main thing is that these surfaces are made up of a little bit of green, a little bit of yellow. It isn't like you just end up coloring in the entire apple just one solid red. You start kind of working with these things. So I'm going to cut that down just a little bit, like in through there. All right. See if I can't speed this up a little bit. Outside edge is a little bit lighter with a highlight. Okay. All right, so the other thing that I have is a white, this is a Faber-Castell white 101 big brush. And this can also be very handy to use for the highlights. And so I'm kind of looking at the really bright white highlights, and I can kind of just daub that in a little bit. And it's a little bit on the transparent side, which is fine because all you have to do is you can get some really nice kind of subtle effects. But then once it dries, you can put another coat on top of it, and you can keep on going until you get kind of a really nice highlight. There's another really bright highlight over here. I haven't really developed that, so it's dark enough, but since I'm kind of trying to rush through this, we'll let that dry a little bit. Down here, there's just a little bit of this kind of, it's almost like a little bit in through here. So you can add these highlights with the big brush. You can even put in a little bit of a white first with the colored pencil, the white colored pencil, and then on top of that white colored pencil, you can see that gets a lot more intense. Occasionally, you might have to wipe the tip off. So you can see how bright that highlight can be. And then I've got a couple of highlights that are kind of coming down in here a little bit. Yeah, one highlight that's right up and through here. But unless I kind of develop the rest of this so it's a little bit darker, it's not going to be quite as dramatic. But, again, I'm just trying to. Okay, there's a little bit of a highlight in this white that kind of comes through here. Okay, so I want to go back to developing some of this. Yeah, we're just about out of time, which is right when this is getting good. So does anybody in the audience there have a question? You can feed it through Krista, but I hope that, we didn't quite get the whole thing totally finished, but whatever you've been working on, you can take your time to finish. You could try another one. but I think that you get kind of the general gist of what's happening. The one thing that I haven't had a chance to do, if you look at the surface of your apple, a lot of times, like in this really dark area, let me very quickly, I know we're running a little bit over here, but let me just put a little more darkness in here, and then it gets very dark down here. So maybe I'll kind of overemphasize it in order to kind of get the point made here. Okay, what I can do is just put some very light dots here. Kind of if you look at your apple, it's just, when you're really being observant, it's kind of amazing to see what actually is on the surface of an apple. Okay, now once those dry, then what I'd like to do is take a pit pen. These are brush points, and when you put them down, they're absorbed nicely by the paper. If you let them dry a little bit, they're transparent. So I can keep on building up with the same pit pen. If I let them dry, put another layer on top, put it dry, put another layer on top. But because they're kind of transparent, what I can do then, once these are dry here, then I can just put a little bit of the pit pen. These aren't quite dry, but you'll get the idea that it's a way of lightening up what's already down there. So if I have a really dark Pichromos pencil down there and I put these little white dots, then I can go back with a lighter, kind of a pit pen that will then make these very subtle little kind of textured dots that are very similar to kind of what you can find on the side of the apple. And then to further kind of bring those out, I noticed on mine, there's kind of like a greenish brown, or kind of some of them have a little bit of a purple to them. So I can just put just a tiny little, just a little bit of a shadow, or like a little bit of an outline around those a bit to kind of make them pop out a little bit similar to the way they are on the apple itself. So to sum up, you want to kind of develop the apple so that it looks like it's this shape, instead of just being a flat kind of cutout type looking thing.
Franz, can you what the color of the pit pen is?
Yes, this one is a number 132. Okay. All right. So now what I want to do is kind of come back and maybe start getting some darker shadows in through here that'll make these little kind of things pop off. But look for where, down here, down below, all of a sudden, on that part of the apple, I have a much lighter area. So if what I would want to do is continue to kind of develop the color and the patches of color and whatnot as I have, but then in through here, I'll go back with a white pencil and just kind of put that highlight in. And those are the highlights, these little dots, kind of following the contour of your shape. Those are all the kind of things that when you see them all together, then they're going to give you kind of a nice looking apple. Here, here's an example of one that I did. I was just kind of horsing around before we got started, and you can see, the effectiveness of the highlights. And I got a couple little things in through here. It's very dark in through here. It's got a highlight in through there. Then, when I was working downstairs in my studio, I actually had 3 shadows and that type of stuff. And then here's an altogether different type of apple, different shape of an apple. It had a different coloration to it. This one I didn't quite get finished, but it was, kind of working along the same thing. It had, some bruising. So I got the old brown out and started kind of working where some of the bruises are. So you can experiment, get your apple out, try different apples, try different pencil combinations. But, if you keep practicing at it and working at it, then you know, you get pretty handy with able to do your apples. Okay, any other questions or? Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. Yeah, any questions? If not, thank you for coming. Get your apples, and then, you know, really the best thing that you can do after you're done drawing your apple is to eat it. Eat the evidence. So stay healthy and happy, and thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you, Franz. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight.
Good night, everybody.